Last century, a newspaper printed a question and they invited people to send in their answers to that question. They were going to select a variety of the responses that came in and then print them in the paper. And the question was this one: what is wrong with the world? What is wrong with the world? Now, I wonder how you would answer that question. I imagine that many people in our country at the moment would say politicians. They are what's wrong with the world. Is there anyone would agree with that? I'm getting a few nods around the room. And that's people on either side of the Brexit debate. Everyone thinks it's the politicians. Now, that might be a very popular opinion. It might be that you would say injustice. That's what's wrong with the world, people being treated unfairly. It might be, if you're just looking a little closer to home, you might say it's my next door neighbour. That's what's wrong with the world. On the school run, when I'm walking with my boys, when I'm not thinking it's them that's wrong with the world, I'm thinking that it's whoever doesn't clean up after their dog is what is wrong with the world. That's something that really winds me up. But maybe we would say it's any number of things: prejudice, hatred, bitterness. Or it might be that we think back to how the world used to be and how it is now and the change in people's values, and we might say that change is what's wrong with the world. It's that subject, what's wrong with the world, that I want to talk about today with you. And the answer is hidden away in one of the songs that Jonathan sang for us. It's hidden away in there. That song that he sang called Reckless Love, that talks about a kind of spend everything, risk everything, give up your greatest treasure kind of love that God has for humanity. It's not a song that's saying God is reckless, because that word might have come across as quite strange to some of you. It's not saying God is reckless. It's saying from a human perspective, when we look at what God is prepared to do in order to save us, humanly speaking, we should be full of open-mouthed amazement at what God will do in order to save men and women. And if we grasp that, then we'll have an answer to that question: what is wrong with the world? We should, in response, be overflowing with thanks to the God who made us. So Jenny read that very, very famous passage from the Bible. It's often called the parable of the prodigal son. Just as a show of hands, who knew that before it was read? Is that most people in the room? Yeah, okay. It's often called that, the parable of the prodigal son. But actually, if you read it really, really carefully, it's not a story about one son. It's a story about a father who has two sons. That's where it begins. It says there was a father who had two sons, and it's actually a story about two different ways that we can be estranged from God, two different ways we can be cut off from him. And prodigal, I have to confess, it's one of those words that I have to look up to understand the meaning of. And according to the dictionary, this is what prodigal means. It means to be recklessly extravagant and to have spent everything. That's what prodigal means, to be recklessly extravagant and to have spent everything. And on face value, that describes the youngest son in the story. He gets his dad's money and he blows all of his inheritance in a really short time. But actually, I think the one who is most extravagant in the story is the father. The father is the most extravagant, and we're going to look at that and we're going to try and draw that out together, because the father is a picture for us of what God is like and how extravagantly loving he is towards all of us. So these two sons, they show two different ways to be cut off from God. Let's look at them individually. So son number one, this is probably the one that we concentrate a lot of the time when we read the story. He comes to his father and says, "Dad, give me my inheritance right now. Give me my inheritance now." Now that's a shocking thing for a son to say to a parent, isn't it? Because what it's actually saying is this, and it was saying it even more in the time of Jesus. It was a son going to their father and saying this: "Dad, that breathing that you're doing right now, that's kind of inconvenient for my plans for my life. You have all of that money, you have all of that land, and I know I'm going to get my share of it when you die, but I'd like that moment to be right now. Effectively, he's going to his dad and he's saying this: be dead for me. Be dead for me. Now that would be deeply hurtful, wouldn't it? Deeply hurtful. The son would be saying, I want your things, but I don't want you. I want your money, but I don't want to be in relationship with you. You are a means to an end, and the end is the things that you can give me. And that is what humanity can do with God. We can go to God and we can say, I want all of the blessings that you can give to me, but I don't want you. And there's people who do that all the time. They throw off following God, they throw off following his rules, and they go out and live exactly how they want. They want what God can give them. They don't want God. And remarkably in the story, the father does it. He does it. In the culture of the day, he was well within his rights to beat his son and throw him out of the house. But he doesn't. He agrees to his request, and literally it says this: he divides his life between his two sons. He releases him, he lets him go, and the story continues. After a short time after coming to his dad and saying, I want your stuff, but I don't want you, the son drives the knife in even further, because he leaves and he disappears over the horizon and he's gone. And in that far country that he goes to, if you know the story, he does whatever he wants to do with all of his dad's stuff. Free from his father's eyes, free from his father's control, he recklessly spends everything, wastes his father's wealth completely. And that's a picture of humanity. That's a picture of how humans relate to God. We don't want to be under God, we want to be free from him. But inevitably, in this story, as so often in our lives, there comes a moment when things fall apart for this first son. The money goes, he's run out, a famine hits, and he's starving to death. And I think into every life, these kind of moments come. Maybe for some they come more quickly, and for some people they come more often. But every life hits a time of sickness or bereavement or tragedy or loneliness, and it feels like everything's a famine. That's where the son's got to. He's hit rock bottom, and he ends up working in a field feeding pigs. And the story says he's so hungry, he wants to eat pig food. Now, quite often we go to Hollertree's farm and we feed the pigs there. I would not want to eat what we feed the pigs, especially once it's landed in the pig pen. It's just going to be horrible. And for a Jewish man, this is about as low as it gets. You can't sink much further than to stink like a pig, feeding pigs, wanting to eat pigs' food, which is one of their most unclean animals that they can think of. So what does he do? What does this son do? Is there any hope? Well, he thinks to himself, and I think he gets to the point that he thinks maybe there is some hope. Just a maybe. And from that place of clarity where he thinks maybe there is some hope, he then says, you know what? I'll go back home. I'll go back home. I'll go back to my father's house. He might hire me, and I might be able to pay off some of the debt that I've built up for him. He doesn't think he can go back to being a son. He thinks he's blown that completely, but he's thinking maybe I can go back home and I can begin to pay my father back. And I think that is sometimes how we try to fix things with God. We know that we've messed things up. We know we're kind of estranged for him. And we think, if I reform myself, if I do some good things, maybe over time I'll do enough to have worked my way back into relationship with God. I think that's how we think. If I just do enough, I might make it. And this, as the son comes home, is where we get to see the vast, extravagant, prepared to spend anything kind of love that God has for people. Because what you have in this story is the son walking home. And it's as if a figure appears on the horizon, and the dad is watching the horizon. He's scanning it probably every single day. He sees a shape in rags in the distance, and he knows it's his boy. And he knows it's his boy coming home. And maybe the stories of how he's been living have reached him because the older brother says he's wasted all the money on prostitutes, Dad. And so maybe this father knows what his son's done with all of his wealth. But actually, he's not bothered. He just runs across the fields to him. He does something which people in their world would never do. A man would never run in their culture because they would have looked stupid. He makes himself look stupid. And as he gets there, probably the smell of pig starts to hit his nostrils. And the son sees the dad running towards him, and he's thinking, okay, it's time to deliver my speech. And he's got this whole speech which he's going to say, I've sinned against heaven, I've sinned against you, I'm not worthy to be called your son. When he tries to deliver the speech, the dad cuts him off. It's almost as if he's not listening. He's not listening to what the boy is saying. And as fast as the son is saying, I've sinned against you, the dad is saying, get a robe, get the best robe, put it on my boy. And in that house, whose is the best robe going to be? It's going to be the dad's robe. He's saying, get my best robe and put it on my boy. He says, put sandals on his feet. He says, put a ring on his finger, which is a sign that you were a son and you were back in the family. He says, kill that calf we've been saving for a celebration, and let's celebrate because my son is back. He was dead and now he is alive again. That is what God is like. That's what God is like. He's extravagant. It's like he's scanning the world, looking for those who are hoping that one day he might forgive them, and he showers them with blessing. He runs to you, he says, you're my child, he covers you, and he forgives you. We sang earlier on, the vilest offender who truly believes, that moment from Jesus a pardon receives. This story says that. God is not interested in our attempts to clean ourselves up to get right with him. He just wants us to come to him and for him to forgive us. That's what he wants us to do. Not because of what you've done, but because of what he's done through Jesus Christ. How many of us in the room believe this? If God saw you in the distance, he'd run over fields for you. It's a good thought. It's a good thought. And it's true. And in the song that Jonathan sang, there's these words. There's no wall you won't kick down. There's no lie you won't tear down coming after me. Humanly speaking, that kind of love is extravagant and it looks reckless to us. But it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And God would say to us today, this is who I am. This picture is who I am. And I think if someone understands that and they get to see that this is the kind of God that the Bible talks about, then they'll never abuse that relationship. They'll never say, I can get away with anything now because I'll be forgiven. They'll think, this God forgave me. I'm going to follow him all the days of my life. And so the estranged son is restored to his father, and they go in and they have this great big party. It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story. People who can wander far from God, God can forgive. But that's just son number one. It's a man who has two sons. The other son shows us another way that we can be cut off from God. Because he's been well behaved, he's been good, he's stayed at home, he's followed all the rules. And when we look at him, we see that he is just like the other one. He actually wants to be free from his father. He wants to go and celebrate and have fun with his friends. He's viewed his father as a means to an end. He also wants the father's things, but he doesn't want the father. So when he hears the party for his returned brother, he's mad. Did you notice that in the story? He's mad. He gets angry. He hears music and he hears dancing. He's kind of white hot with rage. He refuses to come into the party that the father throws for the son who's come home. And again, showing what a loving father he is, this father breaks from convention again and he goes out to his boy and he begs him. He begs his son, come into my party. Be happy about what's happened. And the older, well-behaved brother says this, and it reveals his heart. He says these words, all my life I've been slaving for you. He thinks he's a slave. He feels like a slave following all of his dad's commands because he wants his dad's things, but he doesn't want his dad. And this is the other way that we can be estranged from God. The first son is the one who rejects God and he rebels and he lives a really crazy life. The second one stays at home, follows all the rules, would probably be someone who goes to church week in, week out. But because they follow the rules, they think they're entitled to things. They think they're entitled to things from God. He thinks, if I behave in a certain way, my Father is obligated to give me good things. And we can do the same with God. We can say, I followed all of your rules. You should give me a good life now. We want what God can give. We don't want God himself. He too saw his dad as a means to an end. And this is probably the more deadly way to be cut off from God. You think you've done enough to obligate God to bless you. You think you've done enough. You can say things like this, I'm moral, I'm upright, I should be on God's side. He should give me the things that I want. And in the story, it finishes with a cliffhanger. Did you notice that when it's read? We never hear what the second son does. We don't know whether he goes into the party. And the reason Jesus told this was because he was there and he was eating with tax collectors, and the Pharisees, the religious, moral people, said, why'd you do that? And so Jesus tells them this story and says, unless you're happy about the cut-off person coming back to God, you'll miss him completely. And that's perhaps what we need to think about today. Do we seek God for what he can give us or for who he is? The only way for any of us to be reconciled to God is to go back to that question we started with, what is wrong with the world? And when that question appeared in a newspaper in the last century, the paper received a letter from a famous thinker called G.K. Chesterton. And he simply wrote this, Dear Sirs, I am sincerely G.K. Chesterton. He'd got it. He knew what was wrong with the world was his own heart. He made things wrong. He made the world not what it should be. He got it. And the younger son in the story got it as well. Outcasts used to flock to Jesus, and they found forgiveness. Moral, religious people often didn't flock to him. If they had, they would have encountered an extravagantly generous God who would run over the horizon for them. And so I want to just return to that word prodigal and just, again, think about what it means. And let's think about it in terms of God. How is God recklessly extravagant in coming to save us? How is he someone who spends everything? Well, you have to look at Easter for that. You have to look at Easter to see just how extravagant God is with his love for you. Because in order to forgive us, he spends everything. He gives up his greatest treasure of all. Forgiveness, if you've ever forgiven someone, you know it costs. There's always a cost with forgiveness. If someone hurts you and you choose to forgive them, you have to deal with that hurt yourself. And that's something that you pay. In the story Jesus told, the father takes on the pain of forgiving his son. He swallows the debt. He swallows the hits against his reputation. When we come to Easter, we see how God does it for us. And God becomes one of us, and he dies on a cross so that we don't have to. On the cross, Jesus takes the pain of forgiving us upon himself. He experiences all that we deserve. That's what the cross does. That's spending everything for someone that you love. Jesus once said these words: he came to give his life as a ransom, as a payment for many. So I just want to ask you, this Easter, do you know Jesus covers your debt? All the times you've wandered from God, do you know Jesus covers it? Or are you trying to pay it back yourself, one installment at a time? Jesus' last words on the cross were these: it's finished, which also mean it's paid. It's paid, completely and utterly paid. And Easter is a story of overwhelming, never-ending love. We don't deserve it, we couldn't earn it, and yet it's what Easter says is available. So I want to encourage you over the next couple of weeks, if you come to any of our services or any of the other services in the town, just reflect on what Jesus has done. He's spent everything so that he might have you. We're going to pray, and then we're going to sing. Let's pray. Father God, we want to thank you for your word because it teaches us incredible things. It shows us who you are. It shows us your heart. And in this story of two sons, what we really see is that you are a father who will do anything, absolutely anything, to obtain your people back, to get your children back. So to the one who has spent their life far from you, you'll run across fields for them. For the one who stayed at home and tried to be good and tried to be moral but still isn't wanting you, you come out to them and you plead, come into my party. That's the kind of God you are. And we see it most clearly in the fact that your very son came to the cross for us, to pay the price we couldn't pay, to swallow the pain himself. And we thank you for that. And we simply ask this: if we've never really grasped the depths of that, if we've heard it a million times but it's never really hit home, we ask that by your Spirit you might show it to us soon, even tonight. And we ask this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.